Hello everyone, it's Daniel from TechMind Factory and welcome to this new video from the series called Modern Identity, powered by Azure. In this video we are going to talk about single sign-on or SSO with Azure Active Directory B2C. So let's start. Before I will jump into any technical details, let me put a simple example and scenario you are probably familiar with. Let's say that you have access to your Office mailbox, so Outlook, you have access to Azure Portal and subscription, and you have access to Azure DevOps. And now when you will try to open your mailbox in the Office, you will have to authenticate, obviously. You will have to provide your username, password, do some MFA, and after that you will be successfully authenticated and redirected to your mailbox, and you will be able to access it. Now, in the same browser, when you open the new tab and you try to access Azure Portal and you will type portal.azure.com, you will notice that you will not be asked to provide credentials again. You can choose existing account and then access Portal. Then in the third tab, when you will open Azure DevOps and you want to access your specific project, you will also note that you can use the same set of credentials and access Azure DevOps without providing username and password again. And this is what SSO is about. So SSO, or single sign-on, adds security and convenience when users sign in across different kinds of applications secured by Azure Active Directory and Azure Active Directory B2C in this specific example. So in this video, we are going to talk about single sign-on or SSO in the Azure Active Directory B2C. When the user initially signs into an application, Azure AD B2C persists a cookie-based session. And we will talk more about cookies and this session in this video, and I will show you some demo. But please remember that is a very important fact. Once we are authenticated, Azure AD B2C drops a cookie and keeps the session there. Upon subsequent authentication requests, Azure AD B2C reads and validates the cookie-based session and issues an access token without prompting the user to sign in again when accessing applications. So that's very important. Once the cookie is dropped by the Azure AD B2C, and we are trying to access applications secured also by the Azure AD B2C, another application in the same browser, Azure AD B2C will read the cookie and will validate cookie-based session. So that's why we don't have to provide the credentials once again, because Azure AD B2C can detect that we are already authenticated and we have an active session. If the cookie-based session expires or becomes invalid, the user is prompted to sign in again. So if this session is expired, we will be required to provide our credentials again. Okay, perfect. So now let's talk about three types of SSO sessions in the Azure AD B2C. Because obviously when you think about the session, you think about Azure AD B2C session. Yes, the session managed by the Azure AD B2C. We know that there is a cookie drop in the browser and B2C can manage the session, and yeah, that's how it works. Yeah, but on the other side, there can be external IDP session. So you can try to imagine the situation when application is secured by Azure AD B2C, but on the login screen, you have also the possibility to sign in with Facebook or Google or LinkedIn. So the session is managed by external identity provider like Facebook, let's say. So when we sign in with the Facebook account, even if the application is secured by the B2C by default, there will be two cookies that you will notice in the browser. So there is like a session cookie for the Azure AD B2C, but also in this specific example, Facebook will drop its own session cookie. And obviously, we have application session. So session managed by the web, mobile, or single page application. So in this specific scenario, application can manage its own session or create its own session. So for the web applications, for instance, we can create cookies and we can control the user session independently of the session which is managed by external IDP or Azure Active Directory B2C. Okay, perfect. So right now let's talk a little bit more about Azure AD B2C session. So as we mentioned before, Azure AD B2C stores a cookie-based session on the user's browser once user is authenticated successfully using either local account or account from the external identity provider like Facebook, Google, LinkedIn, and others. The cookie is stored under Azure AD B2C tenant domain name such as techmindfactoryidentity.b2clogin.com. If a user initially signs in with a federated account like Facebook, and then during the session time window or time to leave, TTL, signs in to the same app or different applications, Azure AD B2C tries to acquire a new access token from the federated identity provider. So that's very important. Yes? When we will try to sign in to another application which is secured by the B2C and we use our federated account like Facebook, B2C will try to acquire new access token for this application. If a federated identity provider session is expired or invalid, the federated identity provider prompts the user for their credentials. So as I mentioned before, identity provider, external identity provider, controls its own session with its own cookie. If the session is still active, or if the user has signed in with a local account instead of federated account like Facebook, Azure AD B2C authorizes the user and eliminates further prompts. So in this case, we can truly say that Azure AD B2C is responsible for handling the SSO and the SSO session, yes? So in this specific scenario, we will not have to provide credentials again. Okay, great. So now let's talk a little bit about those cookies when it comes to Azure AD B2C session. When a user successfully authenticates with a local or social account, Azure AD B2C stores a cookie-based session on the user's browser. So when you will open developer tools in your browser like Edge or Chrome, and you will go to cookies, you will notice that for the Azure AD B2C, you have different kinds of cookies. And one of them is session cookie. The cookie is stored under Azure AD B2C tenant domain name, such as techmindfactoryidentity.b2c.com, or custom tenants domain such as login.techmindfactoryidentity.org. So in this case, you will notice that cookies are dropped under specific domain. And then we can see this cookie, see its value and also expiration time. Okay, so now when it comes to cookies in the Azure AD B2C, there are multiple cookies available. So when you will check the documentation for the Azure AD B2C, you will see that there are different kinds of cookies with different kinds of responsibilities. In this specific video, we are focusing on the single sign-on session and SSO, so that's why we'll focus on the cookie responsible for maintaining the SSO session. And this is the cookie that is currently selected on the screen. So it's x-ms-cpim-sso, and here we have also the name of our B2C tenant. So it can be branded domain or b2clogin.com. And this cookie is responsible for maintaining the SSO session. And also, if we enable Keep Me Sign In functionality, which we also will describe in this video, this cookie will be set as persistent. It means that once we will close the browser and we will open it again, this cookie will be still there in the browser and we will not have to authenticate again. So we will not have to provide credentials once again, to be more specific. So after B2C session, we have application session, as I mentioned. In a typical scenario, web application can create its own cookie, as I mentioned before, with the user's session or use tokens. So if you use, for instance, Blazor web applications, you will see that when you use Microsoft Authentication Library, you use tokens. So Microsoft Authentication Library caches tokens in the either session storage or local storage. We can configure that. Mobile applications typically use tokens like ID tokens, access tokens, refresh tokens. On the mobile device, we can also use cookies due to the fact that we have system browser like Safari on iOS device. So that's very important to be mentioned, that obviously when it comes to the mobile world, we typically use tokens, but still please remember that if you use system browser to authenticate users, you have the same ecosystem like in the standard browser, yes? So you have cookies. So once you are authenticated in the Safari and you will open another application also secured by the B2C, which uses the Safari on the iOS device, B2C will detect existing session and you will not have to authenticate again on the mobile device. If there is no app session or the session has expired, the application will take user to the Azure AD B2C sign-in page. So that's very important. If there is no existing session expired, user will be taken to the sign-in page of the Azure AD B2C. Mobile applications can use refresh tokens to refresh the session for the users already authenticated. And that's very popular in the mobile applications world. So we use refresh tokens. So once we receive ID token, access token, and refresh token, obviously ID token and refresh token have shorter lifetime. So if the access token is about to expire, then refresh token is used to get new set of tokens after calling a token endpoint of the Azure AD B2C. So that's very helpful, and this is why you have this experience that every time you use mobile application, you don't have to provide any credentials once you successfully authenticated. You are always authenticated, but underneath, believe me, that mobile application is handling token refresh for you. Okay, great. So when it comes to federated identity provider session, external identity provider like Facebook or Salesforce manages its own session separately from Azure AD B2C and application sessions. That's very important. That's like a totally separated session. Even if you sign in with Facebook in the Azure AD B2C, because of the fact that you configure federation between Azure AD B2C and Facebook, you will still have two cookies and two sessions managed. One by the Azure AD B2C and one by the Facebook. The cookie is stored under identity provider's domain name, such as login.facebook.com, as I mentioned before. So under specific domain, we have specific cookies. Azure AD B2C doesn't control the federated identity provider session. This is really, really important to remember. Azure AD B2C only controls its own session. So federated identity provider controls its own. So it's not like Azure AD B2C controls the session of Facebook. When user selects Facebook login button on the Azure AD B2C sign up or sign in page, the user is redirected to Facebook. If there is an active session at Facebook because of the fact that user is already authenticated in Facebook, the user is not prompted to provide their credentials and is immediately redirected to the Azure AD B2C with a Facebook token. Then Azure AD B2C establishes its own session. So that's very important. Like even if we are already authenticated in Facebook, then B2C will establish its own session. Perfect. So right now it's time to talk about Azure AD B2C session configuration. So what about web application session lifetime? So probably when you work with user flows, you saw this option on the right side. If you use custom policies, you will see this XML configuration on the left side. So what is web application session lifetime? This is the amount of time the Azure AD B2C session cookie is stored on the user's browser after successful authentication. So when we authenticate with the Azure AD B2C, we provide username, password, and then we are redirected back to the application. As you remember, I mentioned that B2C will drop its own session cookie. And we can decide how long this cookie will be available for the application and for the session, yes? So it's worth to mention that the session lifetime can be set between 15 minutes up to 24 hours. So if we set 15 minutes, and this is what I will show you during the demo, if we authenticate in one application secured by the Azure AD B2C, and immediately we will open another tab in the browser and we will try to open another application secured by the Azure AD B2C, you will notice that SSO works. So we don't have to provide credentials. But if we will exceed this time, like 15 minutes, so we will wait, let's say 16 minutes, and then we will try to open another tab and access another application secured by the Azure AD B2C, you will see that we will have to authenticate again. Why? Because the session will be expired. Okay, so now when it comes to session timeout, there are like two kinds of session expiry types. So first of all, what is web application session timeout? It indicates how a session is extended by the session lifetime setting or the keep me sign in setting, which we will talk about in a minute in this video. So we have two kinds of expiry types for sessions. The rolling one, so the session is extended every time the user performs a cookie-based authentication, and this is default configuration. So every time we contact Azure AD B2C, our session is extended. And it's very important to be mentioned, yeah? Like if we have existing cookie in our browser and valid session, and we will go to the B2C, again, our cookie, session cookie will be refreshed, and the session time will be extended. But also, we can set the expiry type to absolute. So this indicates that the user is forced to re-authenticate after the time period specified. Yes? So in this case, we can say that, okay, after 15 minutes, user has to authenticate again. So in this case, we will not extend the session type, the session time. Okay, great. So now let's talk about Azure AD B2C SSO configuration. Because there are different scopes also for the SSO. Obviously, the typical one you are familiar with is the tenant scope. So using this setting, which is default, allows multiple applications and user flows in the Azure AD B2C tenant to share the same user session. So for example, if user signs into one application secured by Azure AD B2C, user can also seamlessly sign into another one upon accessing it. So it means that if we have two applications secured by Azure AD B2C tenant, if we already authenticated in one application, we will not have to provide credentials when accessing the second application. Why? Because there is the tenant SSO configuration. B2C will detect the active session for this specific user, and we will not have to provide any credentials. We will be authenticated by default. But there can be a situation when we need different SSO scope. So in this case, we can change the scope from the tenant to application. This setting allows to maintain a user session exclusively for an application independent of other applications. For example, we can use this setting to make user to sign into Cloud Pharmacy application regardless of whether the user is already signed in to Cloud Groceries. That's very important. So there can be a situation where we don't want to share the session between different kinds of applications. So then, even if user is authenticated in application number 1, secured by Azure AD B2C, and user will open application number 2 in the same browser in the second tab, user will have to authenticate again, will have to provide credentials once again to be more precise. Another scope, policy or user flow. This setting allows to maintain a user session exclusively for a user flow or custom policy independent of the applications using it. So for example, if the user has already signed in to one application secured by a specific custom policy or user flow, the user can be given access to multiple applications as long as the session tied to the user flow doesn't expire. So that's very important, that in this specific scenario, the session scope is set to the policy or user flow. So as long as session for this specific policy, which can be used by multiple applications, is still active, user will not have to provide any credentials. And the last scope, suppressed. So this setting forces the user to run through the entire user flow upon every execution of the policy. So it means that there is no SSO every time user has to provide a set of credentials, authenticate, and then user can access applications secured by the Azure AD B2C. Great. So once we understand the session and we know what are different kinds of scopes for the session configuration in the Azure AD B2C, there is also this one more interesting setting. Enable keep me signed in. So it's very important to explain how it works, because from my experience, I know that this generates a lot of confusion, especially when we talk about the Azure AD B2C session, when we talk about expiration for the session, when we talk about closing the browser window, and so on. So there is an option to enable a feature called Keep Me Signed In for users of web and native applications who have local accounts in the Azure AD B2C. So when we enable this setting on the login page, we have this checkbox with the label Keep Me Signed In. When this feature is enabled, it allows users to choose to stay signed in even after they close the browser. To achieve this, a persistent cookie is set to maintain the session. This cookie is removed when user signs out from the application and from the Azure AD B2C. So when we talk about the standard web application session, and when we talk about the standard session, the standard session for the Azure AD B2C, there is this limitation that once we close the browser, cookies are gone. So this session cookie for the Azure AD B2C is cleared out from the browser. So to make sure that we can stay signed in and we will not have to provide credentials after closing the browser and opening again with the application, we can use Keep Me Signed In feature. So let's talk a little bit more about this feature. So Keep Me Signed In can be enabled for custom policies and user flows. So again, on the right side, there is a configuration for the user flow. So we can enable Keep Me Signed In session, and also we can set the amount of days for the session to remain in the browser. And on the left side, we have configuration in the custom policies, so in the XML files. So we can see that we have this attribute called keep alive in days, and here we can specify how many days we want to persist the session cookie in the browser. Keep Me Signed In should not be enabled on public computers. Why? Because once we will be authenticated and we will close the browser, the cookies will be still there. So if anyone else will open the browser again, the session will be here, and it means that somebody can access our account in the application. Keep Me Signed In is not supported with password reset or sign-up flows. It's only supported with the login pages. The range for the value is from 1 to 90 days for the Keep Me Signed In session. Setting the value to 0 turns off Keep Me Signed In functionality. Okay, perfect. So now it's time to see it in action. So let me show you the the session cookie, let me show you how SSO works with Azure AD B2C, and let me show you how Keep Me Signed In option works. So let's see it in action. In my scenario, I use custom policies, so I would like to show you how to access a session configuration from the custom policy file. In this case, we have to open sign up or sign in custom policy, so relying party policy that is used by the applications secured by the Azure AD B2C. And under relying party, under default user journey, we have user journey behaviors tag. And here we have single sign-on configuration. The scope is tenant. As you remember, we have 4 scopes. But in this case, I set it to tenant because I want to enable SSO globally for all applications secured by the Azure AD B2C. There is keep alive in days property, and it's set to 30 days. So this one is for the keep me sign in option, which I will describe in a minute. And below that, we have 2 important details added. Session expiry type, so absolute. So as you remember, I mentioned that there is rolling and absolute expiry type. So in this case, user will have to re-authenticate after the session has expired. And this session will expire after this specific time. So we have to define session expiry in seconds. So in this case, it's 900 seconds, so 15 minutes. So session will be valid for 15 minutes. So this session cookie dropped by the Azure AD B2C will be valid for 15 minutes. So after 15 minutes, when user is authenticated in one application and will try to open another application secured by the Azure AD B2C, user will have to authenticate. One important detail to be mentioned here, if we enable Keep Me Sign In functionality, and user selects it on the login page, the session expiry in seconds is overridden by keep alive in days property. So it means that this cookie will be persisted in the browser for 30 days. And obviously, if user will not select Keep Me Sign In, session expiry in seconds will be used. Okay, great. So right now, let's see 2 demo applications secured by the Azure AD B2C to see SSO in action. Here are my 2 web applications, Blazor applications, deployed to the Azure cloud. So this is my app 1, Azure Websites.net, and here is my app 2, Azure Websites.net. So now those 2 applications are secured by the Azure AD B2C. So now let me show you how SSO works. As you can see, in both applications, I'm not authenticated yet, so I have to click login button. So let me start with application 1. I will click login button, and then after a few seconds, I'm redirected to the Azure AD B2C. And as you can see, on the B2C side, login page, I have Keep Me Signed In option, but for now, I will not use it. So in this specific scenario, let me type my credentials and let me sign in. So I will click sign in. And now I'm redirected successfully to the web application. I'm authenticated successfully. And now I can start using different kinds of functionalities. Now when I open application number 2, and I will refresh it, you will see that I'm still not authenticated here. But if I will click login button, I'm redirected to the Azure AD B2C, but because of the fact that I was already authenticated and B2C dropped the session cookie in my browser, I do not have to provide any credentials again. I'm authenticated automatically and redirected to my application. And I can again start using its functionalities. Perfect. So this is how SSO works in the Azure AD B2C on the tenant level scope. We don't have to provide credentials again and again. We have this option to provide credentials only once and then access different kinds of applications secured by the Azure AD B2C. So now let me show you what is happening from the cookies perspective. Let's authenticate once again, but with developer tools opened. So here we will track what is happening with the session cookie. So again, what I will do, I will click login button, but before that, please note that I clear all the history in my browser. So I will click login button again, and I'm redirected to the Azure AD B2C login page. Here I have to provide my credentials, and after that I will be successfully authenticated and redirected to the application. And as you can see, here is the cookie drop for my B2C domain, and we can see that under expires column we have session. So it means that after I will close the browser, this cookie will be gone. It will be cleared out. And obviously you can say, okay Daniel, but we set the session expiry to be 15 minutes. And that is correct. This is one of the properties inside this session cookie, which will be used by the Azure AD B2C. But the important fact is that when we will close the browser, this cookie will be gone. Now, because of the fact that I have this cookie in my browser and session is still valid for 15 minutes, I will be able to open another applications secured by the Azure AD B2C in my browser in another tabs, and I will be able to click login button and I will not have to provide any credentials again. But let's wait for 15 minutes and see what will happen. So obviously for this recording, I will pause it and then I will enable it after the cookie expired, the session expired. So let's see. Okay, so we are back after 15 minutes. So as you can see, here is still my application where I authenticated successfully, and I open another tab in my browser with application number 2. And here I'm not authenticated. And normally when the session cookie is still valid, I should not have to provide any credentials. I should be authenticated automatically and redirected to the application. But because of the fact that session cookie expired, probably I will have to authenticate again. So let's see. I will click login button, and now we can see that I'm redirected to the Azure AD B2C. But because of the fact that there is no SSO cookie in the browser, because of the fact that session expired, I have to authenticate again. This is really important. Because of the fact that session cookie expired, when I click login button in the application number 2, I was redirected to the B2C. B2C detected that session is expired and I have to re-authenticate. So that's very important to remember. Okay, perfect. So one last thing I would like to discuss here is about the application session versus Azure AD B2C session. And I would like to show you something here, really important. There can be a lot of confusion when it comes to application session and how it's handled, and the Azure AD B2C session. So let me show you something. If I will click refresh button in the browser, you can see that I'm still authenticated here. So you can ask, okay Daniel, so what's going on here? There is no cookie, because as you can see, there is no cookie for the B2C anymore because session expired, but I'm still authenticated here. So this is about different kinds of sessions. Session managed by the application and session managed by the Azure AD B2C. Please remember that B2C has no information about what is happening inside your application. B2C uses session cookie to detect whether the session is still active or it's expired. So in this specific scenario, if I will not contact B2C directly, I will not redirect user directly to the B2C, there is no information about session expiration. And another fact is that please remember that session can be stored and managed by the cookies, but also on the other side, we have tokens, ID tokens, refresh tokens, and access tokens. It means that those have separate life cycles. It means that even if the session cookie is expired, it doesn't mean that the token is expired, like refresh token is expired. So please remember that when building your applications, you can face this issue, and I know that many people face it, when there is a still valid token, like ID token, and session cookie expired, and like there is this confusion, like how it's possible that I'm still authenticated in the application. I should be signed out from the application. So let me show you something. When it comes to Blazor and other web applications secured by Microsoft Identity Platform and Azure AD B2C, in a typical scenario, you use Microsoft Authentication Library to secure access to your application and handle authentication, redirections to the Azure AD B2C, and so on. So with Microsoft Authentication Library, we use tokens. So we can decide where to store those tokens. So Microsoft Authentication Library provides two ways to store token and tokens. It can be those tokens can be stored either in the local storage or the session storage. The session storage is cleared out when we close the browser, and the local storage, the items in the local storage remain after closing the browser window. We can change this configuration in the source code. If I will open local storage and session storage, you will see that session storage is empty. But under local storage here, because I configured Microsoft Authentication Library to store tokens in the local storage, you can see that here I have 3 different kinds of tokens. There is ID token. As you can see, the credential type is ID token. There is also the refresh token, as you can see. So credential type refresh token. So now, despite the fact that there is no SSO cookie, I have the set of tokens in my browser here, as you can see. So as I mentioned, refresh token, ID token, my session is still active. I can still use the refresh token to get new set of tokens, and I will not have to re-authenticate again. So it's really important to understand that session cookie is something different than tokens. So in this specific scenario, even if I have no cookies in my browser, but still I have active tokens, an active refresh token, I can use it to get new set of tokens like ID tokens, access tokens, and refresh tokens. But what I can do, I can clear the local storage, and I will do it right now. And I will show you that after clearing the local storage, I will have to re-authenticate again, and application will show the login button again. So let me clear the local storage for this application, and let me refresh the application. As you can see, because of the fact that I cleared out the local storage, I have to re-authenticate again. And this is really, really important to remember. So the session cookie is used by the Azure AD B2C to manage SSO. So once we authenticate with Azure AD B2C, B2C will drop its own cookie, session cookie. It will be in our browser. And this cookie is used by the Azure AD B2C to detect active session for the user, and we will not have to provide credentials again when we will open another application secured by the Azure AD B2C in another tabs in our browser. Okay, perfect. So right now we understand what happened here. But there is also one more thing. Keep me sign in functionality. So as I mentioned, when I will close the browser, the cookie will be cleared out. But if I will use persistent cookie and I will use keep me sign in functionality, when I will close the browser, cookie will be still there. And after opening the browser again, I will not have to re-authenticate again. So let's see it in action. Great, so let's click Login button again. And on the login page from the Azure AD B2C, I will select Keep Me Signed In checkbox. I have to provide my credentials here, so username and my password, and I will click Sign In button. Perfect. I'm redirected to the application, I'm successfully authenticated, and right now I will close the browser. And now let's open it again and see what will happen. Here is the browser open again, and as you can see, there is no user session because of the fact that I changed the configuration for Microsoft Authentication Library to store the tokens in the session storage. It means that all the tokens were removed after closing the browser. However, I have still persisted cookie in my browser dropped by the Azure AD B2C. It means that when I will click Login button, I should not have provide credentials again. I should be automatically authenticated by the Azure AD B2C and redirected to my application. So let's see it. I will click Login button, and after a few seconds, I should be redirected to the B2C login page. And as you can see, I'm already authenticated. B2C detected the session cookie that is still active, and I didn't have to provide my credentials again. Also, as you can see, there is this persistent cookie stored in my browser. So as you can see here, if I will expand the expires column, we can see that there is the time when this specific cookie will expire. So we see that it was extended for 30 days, as I showed you at the beginning in the custom policies. So it means that this cookie will be stored in the browser for approximately 1 month. It means that even if I will close the browser and open it again and close it and open it again, this cookie will be there for 30 days. And it means that if I will click Login button, I will be redirected to the Azure AD B2C. Azure AD B2C will check this session cookie, and then Azure AD B2C automatically will authenticate me, and I will be automatically redirected back to the application. So, as you can see, it really helps improve user experience because of the fact that I do not have to provide credentials again and again. And just to summarize a few details here. So first of all, when it comes to SSO, we can enable it at the tenant level. There are 4 different scopes, as I mentioned before. But if we will enable it at the tenant level, B2C will drop the cookie, and then every time we are accessing applications secured by the Azure AD B2C from our browser in multiple tabs, we will not have to provide credentials multiple times. We have to provide credentials once, and then B2C will detect existing session. The second thing is that to avoid the situation that our session is gone after closing the browser, we can use Keep Me Signed In functionality. It means that SSO cookie will be persistent. It will be kept in the browser even when we close the browser, and when we will open it again, cookie is still there. Azure AD B2C will detect it, detect the existing session, and we will not have to provide credentials again. Last thing, managing session on the application side. As I mentioned, there is session cookie, obviously dropped by the Azure AD B2C, but also application can have its own session, like we saw here in this demo. We had a set of tokens like refresh token and ID token, and we can use those tokens to control the session on the application side. It means that even if the session cookie expired, the one for the Azure AD B2C, but we still have valid tokens and still valid refresh token, we can still use it to obtain new set of tokens for our user. So it's really important to make sure that we understand those concepts. Yeah. So the session cookie is used by the Azure AD B2C for the SSO, but on the application side, we can also have our own session management, obviously with the cookies too. We don't have to use tokens, we can use cookies, but it's on us, developers, to control how the application will behave when it comes to session expiration, redirection to the B2C, and so on. Great. So that's it about the SSO. I hope you enjoyed this video and see you in the next videos. Thank you so much for watching.